The envelope was sitting on the dining room table when I walked in from my shift, still in my scrubs, still smelling like antiseptic and 12 hours of other people's emergencies. My mother-in-law was standing beside it. Not sitting, standing, the way you stand when you've been rehearsing something. "Happy birthday, Simone," she said. I was 32 years old that day. I had worked a double at the hospital because my charge nurse had called in sick, and I had never once in 7 years said no to covering a shift. I was exhausted in the specific way that only emergency room nurses understand, not tired in your body, but tired somewhere deeper, in the place where you keep your patients. I looked at the envelope, then at her, then at my husband who was leaning against the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed and his eyes on the floor. "Open it," she said. I did. I wish I could tell you I was surprised. My husband's name is Thomas, and when I met him, we were both 26, and he was the funniest person I had ever been in a room with. He made me laugh so hard at a mutual friend's backyard party in Oakville that I spilled my entire drink down the front of my shirt and didn't even care. He called me the next morning. We were engaged 18 months later. His mother, Evelyn, did not come to our engagement dinner. She said she had a prior commitment, a fundraiser gala for the hospital foundation. Not my hospital, the one her family had donated a wing to, the one in Forest Hill where her husband had been chief of cardiology for 20 years before he died. She sent flowers to the restaurant. White lilies, the kind you put on a casket. Thomas said she was just adjusting. He said she would come around. He said a lot of things in those early years that I held on to the way you hold on to a banister in the dark. Not because you're sure it's stable, but because it's the only thing there. She never did come around. From the very beginning, Evelyn made it clear that I was not what she had envisioned for her son. She didn't say it directly. She was far too careful for that. It came in the way she looked at my hands when I reached across the table. "Nurse's hands," she said once, pleasantly, as if she were complimenting me on something, as if the calluses and the short-clipped nails were a charming little hobby rather than the result of a decade of keeping people alive. She asked me, at our first Christmas dinner at her house in Rosedale, whether I had ever considered going back to school. "Medicine," she said, "would be a natural next step, wouldn't it? Thomas's first wife." She paused there. That deliberate little pause, his first serious girlfriend, had been a physician. Internal medicine. Thomas said nothing. I passed the gravy and smiled and said that I loved what I did. "Of course you do," Evelyn said. "The thing about being a nurse in a wealthy family is that they know they need people like you. They just don't want to sit across from you at dinner." I had held her husband's hand in his final weeks. I hadn't been his nurse, but I understood what his nurses had done, and I saw in Evelyn's eyes that she knew I understood, and somehow that made it worse for her. I had seen the inside of something she wanted to keep polished and external. Thomas and I bought a house in Hamilton in our 3rd year of marriage. His family called it practical. The way they said practical made it sound like a diagnosis. We weren't unhappy, not exactly. We were the particular kind of not unhappy that looks like a marriage from the outside and feels like a waiting room from the inside. Thomas worked long hours in financial consulting. I worked long hours at the hospital. We were polite with each other. We were kind. We just had stopped being on the same side of anything. I knew something was shifting the year I was accepted into the nurse practitioner program at McMaster. I had applied quietly, told no one except my closest colleague, a woman named Frances who had been working the same ER unit as me for 4 years and who reacted to the news by buying me a coffee and saying simply, "Good." I studied on my lunch breaks and after night shifts and on Sunday mornings when Thomas played golf. I didn't tell him until after I was accepted because I think even then I knew what he would say. He said it was a lot of added pressure. He said the timing wasn't great. He said maybe wait a year. I enrolled anyway. That was when Evelyn started calling more frequently. The envelope contained divorce papers. Not a letter, not a conversation. Printed, formatted, already signed by Thomas on the 3rd page. All that was missing was my name. I stood in my own kitchen in my scrubs on my 32nd birthday and I read through them slowly. I am a thorough reader. 12 years of clinical documentation will do that to you. I read every clause. Evelyn watched me with her hands folded in front of her like she was waiting for an exam result she already knew. We feel it's better this way, she said. We. Thomas has a great deal ahead of him, and we think. I'm going to need a few minutes, I said. I walked to the bathroom. I sat on the edge of the tub. I breathed. Here is what I thought about. I thought about the patient I had coded 3 nights earlier, a 54-year-old man who had come in clutching his chest, and how his wife had stood in the hallway with her hands pressed flat against the wall like she was trying to hold the building up, and how I had come out to tell her he was stable, and she had simply exhaled one long shaking breath like she had been holding it her entire life. I thought about how I had not felt that way about Thomas in a very long time. I thought about the McMaster acceptance letter folded inside my copy of a pharmacology textbook on the nightstand on my side of the bed. I thought, I have been preparing for this without knowing I was preparing for it. I stood up. I washed my face. I walked back to the kitchen. Evelyn was still standing. Thomas had not moved. I picked up the pen from the counter where they'd left it. They had left a pen, they had planned this so carefully, and I signed my name. Thomas blinked. Evelyn's smile, which had been preparing itself, froze slightly. Thank you, I said. I'll be in touch with my lawyer. What they didn't know was that I had spoken to a lawyer 4 months earlier. Not because I had decided to leave, but because Frances, who had been through her own divorce 3 years prior, had sat me down one afternoon in the break room and said, I'm not telling you what to do, but I think you should know what you're entitled to. She said it gently, the way she said everything. Frances delivered hard information the way good nurses do, clearly, calmly, without cruelty. In Ontario, when you've been married for more than 5 years, marital property is divided based on equalization of net family property. The matrimonial home, our house in Hamilton, which had appreciated significantly because that market had done what it had done, was subject to equalization regardless of whose name was on the mortgage. I had contributed to that mortgage for 9 years. I had the records. I also had records of something else. 3 months before Evelyn handed me that envelope, I had noticed a discrepancy in our joint account. Not large enough to seem immediately alarming, but I was precise with numbers. You have to be in nursing where a decimal point can kill someone, and I had pulled the statements and sat with them for an evening and found a pattern. Money moving to an account I didn't recognize on dates that corresponded to nothing in our shared calendar. I mentioned it to my lawyer. She mentioned it to a forensic accountant. The picture that emerged was not pretty. I said nothing. I waited. I went to work. I studied for my NP exams. I made dinner on the nights I was home, and I was pleasant, and I let Evelyn believe she was watching a woman who didn't know what was coming. The divorce proceedings took 7 months. Thomas had expected it to be simple. I think Evelyn had told him it would be simple, that I would be grateful perhaps, or too overwhelmed, or not savvy enough to understand what I was owed. I think she had underestimated what it means to be a person who has worked in emergency medicine for a decade. We are not fragile people. We are people who function precisely when everything around us is falling apart. I retained a lawyer in Toronto who specialized in high-asset divorce. She was a small woman with a very direct gaze and a reputation for being, as Frances put it, someone you want in your corner and nowhere else. We documented everything, the hidden transfers, the timeline, the pattern. Thomas eventually settled. The terms were fair, my share of the home's equalization, a portion of his pension adjusted for the length of the marriage, and the hidden account, which, once the forensic accounting was complete, turned out to be considerably less hidden than he'd thought. Evelyn did not take it quietly. She called me, once, in the middle of the proceedings. I picked up because I was curious. You're being vindictive, she said. I'm being precise, I said. There's a difference. She hung up. I don't know what she had expected me to do. Accept the papers gratefully and disappear, I suppose. Return to whatever she imagined my life would have been without Thomas. Without the house in Hamilton, without the years I had spent trying to fit inside a shape that was never made for me. I graduated from the nurse practitioner program 14 months after the divorce was finalized. Francis was there, in the auditorium at McMaster, whooping in a way that was entirely undignified and completely perfect. My mother flew in from Fredericton. We went for dinner afterward at a restaurant on King Street, and I ordered the tasting menu and a glass of wine that cost more than I'd ever spent on a single glass of wine, and I felt no guilt about it whatsoever. I am now working as an NP in a collaborative family health practice. I manage my own patient panel. I supervise 2 junior nurses. My income is not what Evelyn would have called impressive. She had a very specific idea of what impressive meant. But it is mine entirely, in a way that nothing had been mine entirely for a very long time. I don't think about Thomas very often. When I do, it's not with anger anymore. It's with a kind of clarity, the same clarity you feel when you've been in a difficult shift and you finally step outside and breathe real air. Something that was heavy and constant simply isn't anymore. What I think about more is the woman I was the year before any of this happened, standing in the break room at midnight eating reheated soup, studying pharmacology on her phone, not telling anyone because she didn't know yet whether she would succeed or whether she had the right to try. That woman had no idea what the next 3 years would cost her or what they would give back. I think she would be relieved to know how it ends. Not because of the settlement or the degree or any of the things that can be listed and measured, but because on a Tuesday morning last October, a patient came into my practice, a woman around 60, recently widowed, nervous in the way people are nervous when they haven't been to a doctor in years, and she sat across from me and I could see her deciding whether to trust me. And I watched her decide yes, and I thought, this is what I was meant to be doing. This exactly. Not the version of my life that fit inside someone else's expectations of what I should be. Mine. There's an old saying I heard a chaplain use once, late at night in the hospital when we were both worn down to nothing. He said, "The life you were meant to live will not always be the one that was easiest to reach. Sometimes you have to be handed the ending of one thing before you can find the beginning of another." Evelyn thought she was taking something from me. She had no idea she was setting me free. I thought about that moment in the bathroom a lot since then, sitting on the edge of the tub in my scrubs, holding my own breath, making a decision about what kind of person I was going to be when I walked back out. Nobody tells you that the hardest part of being wronged isn't the wound itself. It's deciding in real time whether you're going to let it define you or inform you. Evelyn handed me those papers thinking she was ending something. What she didn't know was that I had already been quietly building the life she assumed I was too small to have. That's the thing about integrity. And I mean the quiet, private kind, not the kind you perform for an audience. I had kept showing up to my shifts. I had kept studying. I had kept my word to myself even when the person I had promised my life to had stopped keeping his. Nobody saw that part. Nobody gives you credit for the 11 p.m. study sessions or the Saturday mornings you chose a textbook over resentment. But those choices compound. They build something real, even when you can't see it yet. What I understand now, looking back, is that the clarity I felt in that bathroom wasn't luck. It was the result of years of small, honest decisions. When you live with integrity long enough, it becomes structural. It holds you up when everything else is trying to bring you down. I didn't fall apart when Evelyn handed me that envelope, because I had been quietly becoming someone who didn't need Thomas's family to tell her she was worth something. Frances used to say that the smartest thing you can do in a crisis is already know the facts. She was right. The reason I could walk back into that kitchen calmly wasn't courage in the dramatic sense. It was preparation. I had done the reading. I had asked the questions. I had sat with a lawyer 4 months earlier, not because I was planning to leave, but because I believed that understanding your situation clearly was never a betrayal of hope. It was just being honest with yourself about what was real. People mistake that kind of clear-eyed thinking for coldness. It isn't. It's what lets you act from a place of steadiness instead of panic. Evelyn expected tears. She expected negotiation. What she got was a woman who had already done her homework and was no longer afraid of the answer. And then there's the part that nobody talks about enough, the sheer endurance of it. The months of proceedings, the forensic accounting, the calls that didn't go the way you hoped, the days you were tired enough to wonder if it was worth it. Simone kept going not because she was fearless, but because she had decided, somewhere in that bathroom, that she was not going to let someone else's cruelty become the loudest chapter of her life. I think about the woman she was then and the NP she is now, and I see a straight line between them. Not straight in the easy sense, but straight in the true sense. She knew what was right, she did the work, she kept going. That's it, really. That's the whole thing. You don't need to be extraordinary. You just need to be honest, prepared, and willing to still be standing when the dust settles.